Thank you for joining us, Mr. Brennan. Would you please tell us a little bit about yourself and your experience?
Sure. My name is Terry Brennan. I served for 30 years in a large fire department where I was a hazardous materials technician and specialist. Also, through my 30 years in the military, my secondary MOS or job skill was chemical biological warfare. Completed many classes in the field and was designated as the NBC specialist at the port of Shueba when we arrived. And to give you a description of the port of Shueba, it's the major seaport for Kuwait. It handles large container ships, military transport ships, and it was the only one large enough to support the war. As you got to the base, we didn't know it at the time, but the fields that they had cleared were actually waste dumps for the industry that surrounded us on three sides. These were petrochemical refineries, both pesticide and herbicide manufacturers, coke refining, cement work, and just about every type of petroleum product that you can think of, they made. And we had significant weather problems there due to inversion layers and diurnal winds. And what would happen, it would trap the byproducts of carbon monoxide, NOx, which is nitrogen oxide and nitrogen dioxide, and sulfur dioxide. And they ended up building our camp right there. There were days when we choked. A number of us, well, the majority of us, coughed up blood at some time or another, had bloody noses, most of which is all medically documented. But we stayed for the simple fact we knew this was the only port in the area that could support the war effort. And a number of us have paid since. I
was first referred to you by Coast Guard retired Chief Petty Officer Mike Barth. He has an interview that we'll put some pieces in here, but he has some very interesting pictures of your guys' time there in Camp Spearhead. You can see what looks like oil slicks on the ground and pictures of water being stored in hazardous material designated areas. One of these pictures has a number of Draeger test tubes on it. Can you explain what's going on in that picture and the circumstances in which that picture was taken?
Yes, well, shortly after we got there, and it continued through our whole stay, there was off-gassing of chemicals that literally you couldn't see more than 100 yards, either due to the black smoke, the orange haze, and we needed some way of testing. So, being a hazardous materials specialist, I had phoned my fire department, and they had sent me some testing items, including a Draeger tool. And what you're seeing is at any given day, and that particular day, those pictures I took, I had a camera and photographed the tubes that I had used to sample the air. We had a positive, regularly had positives for, of all things, sulfur mustard and sulfur gas. The sulfur mustard agent, obviously it wasn't a vesicant or we'd all been blistering, but we were getting a false positive. We also tested for benzene. I was limited on the Draeger tubes that I had, but I would regularly test. And what you're looking at is a huge amount of benzene in the air on one of the tubes. I believe the other one off the top of my head was the sulfur mustard, which is a vesicant that every soldier will be familiar with. It's a blister agent. I'm not sure, without looking at the picture, what the third tube was, but my guess is it was either ammonia or chlorine because they regularly purged those gases. They used the chlorine liquid, which they dumped in the ocean, and the chlorine gas to sterilize and clean their pipes. So the ammonia was used in refrigerant in the industrial complex. Quite literally, I had soldiers collapse to the ground and we had to bring them inside where it was a little bit better. Some had donned their masks, but the ammonia and the chlorine would eat through the mask. So one of our commanders, 05, he had asked if we could get for our N40 mask chlorine and ammonia filters. And that sampling that I was doing kind of unfolded into them searching for a better way to sample than having an hazmat tech and specialist wandering around with a Draeger tool. So they assigned some Fox vehicles to us.
We'll come back to that in a minute, but a few questions about that. First, what is off-gassing?
Well, these were all releases. These were not accidental. And if they hit a level in their process where they're getting too much of a chemical, it might mess up the process, or it just is chemical waste like the sulfur dioxide, which they would release and quite literally swamp our campsite, which brought about the nose bleeding and the throat bleeding for a number of us. It inflamed our lungs, but it was part of their process. With the chlorine gas, after they ran the liquid through the pipe so they could start another process, let's say they're making gasoline and they want to go to a pesticide, they don't want the remnants of the petroleum or the gasoline, so they would run through the pipes, the liquid chlorine, the chlorine gas, and then what they called a pig or a scrubber that would go through the pipes. This is what they explained to me. I'm not an industrial engineer, so this is kind of anecdotal, if you will. But that's how it was explained to me.
From a medical perspective, benzene is a known carcinogen. It can cause many types of leukemia, of which I know there's veterans who have put in claims for leukemia frequently, which have been denied by the VA, saying you can't prove that this caused this particular problem. But just so that we're all on the same page, we're both talking about the same thing here, yes?
Yes. And by the way, there was a variety of benzenes. There was ethylene benzene, there was isobenzene, I believe, but that's a whole nother story. But yes, we were inundated with benzene.
So you had guys who were donning their chemical gear, and you had chlorine gas in the area. Now, I'm going to state just very briefly that my specialty in the service was intelligence, not in chemical warfare, but I do seem to have an obscure memory that the maximum time that you can don an M40 protective mask and have it protect you against chlorine is somewhere around 15 minutes. Is that accurate?
Yes. The soldiers were saying that had donned it during a chlorine ammonia release, and I don't know if it was a synergistic effect of the two. They said within 5 minutes of putting it on, they could smell the chlorine and the ammonia. It was still a little bit better, but the mask was obviously failing or the filter was failing within 5 minutes. And chlorine is a corrosive gas as well, and I'm sure ammonia is.
So for these soldiers who were donning their protective masks, not only was this not really effective against the chlorine gas that was in the air and the ammonia, but it was also destroying the filter, which would mean that should you guys have someone actually drop some sort of dirty bomb, their mask would be completely ineffective. Is that correct?
On the filters, it says it's not designed for chlorine gas, which was the first modern chemical weapon used at the Battle of Ypres in the First World War. It was chlorine gas. And we know it does not work against chlorine gas.
Do you know if the soldiers who donned these masks received any type of replacement filters?
Yes, just those filters. I have documents that I was copied on from a Navy commander who was trying to get the entire unit a filter that would work. We never received those filters because I don't believe they exist. At least I'd never been trained with a chlorine gas filter for an M40 gas mask.
Is there anything else that you feel like we should talk about with the Draeger tubes?
Well, just the fact that I had numerous tests and we always got well above the 1 day dosage within an hour. There are different guidelines that say for a short-term exposure of 15 minutes and a 1 hour, a 24 hour and a 1 to 14. They never did an annual study on the Schwebe because they never thought they would ever put a unit there more than 60 days. And just as a segue into this, for an exercise they were going to do in the year 2000, the United States Army Environmental Assessment Team came out and did a complete 7-day air soil study, and basically deemed throughout the report, it clearly states that it's unfit and unsuitable for working and living on that site.
As you know, if you do anything in the military, you have to be rated to do something. Like if you're an armorer, you're going to be rated to repair weapons to a higher standard than an average soldier. But was there any special training that you specifically would have to use a Draeger device and tube, and are you trained in all of your training to do that?
Yes, I am. I had just completed a 4-week course and multiple one-day courses on different testing devices, and the Draeger was one of them. Granted, Draeger's fairly easy, but it was a 4-hour course as part of the overall first 4 weeks of hazmat training in California. Then there's a follow-up 2 weeks to that as well. But no, I was more than capable and qualified in the state of California, which, by the way, has the toughest standards.
Okay. So along with the pictures of these Draeger tubes, before we start talking about the environmental survey assessments, you had a number of pictures, or at least Mike Barth had pictures that were taken by you, if I'm correct, and these showed various oil spots on the ground. Can you describe the circumstances of what was going on in those pictures?
Well, we sadly had a release on May 2nd. It's a little bit of a story to get to the point. And this release was sulfur dioxide. It literally put a cloud for 40 minutes over our living space. And then we started getting the documentation. Up until that time, we'd never read these reports by the Army. And what they had told us was they had scraped our area and pushed all of this hazardous waste into a single area. And so I was sent to investigate. And what we found was fairly shocking. There were drums of petroleum products. There was that had been bulldozed and moved into a certain area, along with other waste, which was verified to be asbestos tiles, which had been crushed by these bulldozers that pushed it. Well, in some of the cases, the bulldozers would dig beneath the earth about 8 inches. And when you dig down, the earth was just sandy and dusty. But as you dug down the 6 to 8 inches, suddenly you saw, obviously, oil appear in the sand. And the deeper you dug, the more oozy or more liquefied it became. It wasn't staying dirt, then it became wet if you touched it. Granted, I didn't touch it with my bare hands, but and I took photographs of that. So it was definitely, and I took a reading there as well with the Draeger tool and got fairly high ratings when I held it about 4 feet over the ground. So it probably didn't exceed the 1 day or 1 hour, but you have to remember it probably would have exceeded the 1 to 14 days and definitely the year, because we breathed it every single day.
These documents that you have, the environmental health survey, it said that the maximum recommended time for anyone to live on this base was 60 days, but it recommended that people really not live there, but live off-site and work in shifts. Did that happen?
For the first 23 days, we lived at Arifjan. I believe we were following these standards. But there became a time when they thought it was impractical because it took 45 minutes to an hour to load everybody, get them there, and we were working what we call a naval service, port and starboard, 12 on, 12 off. And so we were burning a couple of hours, and someone thought it was ineffective, so they began to open up this space to make it a living space for us. And that just became a nightmare as time went on. living in this place. And even in the report, they use the term, well, they don't use the term off-gassing, but we commonly do when it comes to carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide poisoning. You need this time to off-breathe it, and they constantly refer in this report that we need to spend time away from the site in order to bring our hemoglobin down to a reasonable amount. Prevents heart attacks and a number of other issues with just the carbon monoxide. I'm not talking about all the other chemicals, but it's true of them as well.
How long did you guys stay out there once you moved from Arab County to Camp Spearhead?
We stayed there from living there the night of January 25th until till August 23rd. And maximum recommended. It's very interesting. This study contradicts itself. It says in several places, troops must not sleep at this site. They need to work there and leave. But then their final recommendations say that we can work there on 12 and 12s. They strongly recommend that we live off-site. So it's, as you read through the report, you'll find there's serious contradictions. So
you guys were out there then way past the 60 days?
Oh, yes. I was there over 230 days, and 23 of those days I did live on another base. What was interesting in this report that we found out, in any given day, and they say it will happen routinely, we will exceed the annual dose for carbon monoxide, nitrogen oxide, nitrogen dioxide, and sulfur dioxide. We'll get our year's dose in one day. That's by OSHA and NIOSH and a number of standards. So we were way overexposed.
One of the recommendations was that you not disturb the sound. And obviously that's easier said than done when you're living in the desert. You're driving through unpaved roads. That's going to kick up dust and dirt. But you mentioned that you scraped the surface of the camp. So there's this big recommendation of don't dig in the dirt, and you guys dug in the dirt. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, the way we came to find out that we weren't supposed to disturb the soil was actually when one of the plant foremans and an MOI police officer had commented that they couldn't understand why we scraped the foam off of the ground, and we all asked, what foam? And he said there was a thin layer of sealant over the fields where we slept and where the new dump was, where we pushed everything to. And I said I was unaware of that. And then he said, well, thank God you haven't dug much deeper than that. And I immediately recalled that we had dug 3-foot deep volleyball pits in the area he was speaking of. And I immediately went to the force security officer and deputy officer and explained to him that we had a problem. And you'll see I had given Mike, and I will send to you the photographs of these pits where we played volleyball in them. But evidently they had buried everything from depleted uranium rounds. There was a battle fought in the first Gulf War near then, and the ground testing by the Army Environmental Team found 2 different types of uranium. They found strontium, they found valindium, and all of these are radioactive materials in the ground where we were playing volleyball. What's interesting, all of these chemicals that they found during their testing, there are 21 VOCs, and there are 15 or 16 of these SVOCs, which just means in the soil, but they're still volatile organic compounds. All of them attack the same organs, which are your eyes, your skin, your upper airway and lower airway, to include sinuses, throat, voice box. Overall, the dermis, we had huge amounts of rashes on people, especially those who played volleyball and were often jogging about, kicking up dust. But the target organs were the lungs with cancer, leukemia, kidney and liver disease and cancers from all of these chemicals that were found there. Those seemed to be the target organs. And we had dug into the ground and unleashed or opened Pandora's box, if you will.
So when you opened Pandora's box, these site surveys were taken and showed all these chemicals, but that was not in the presence of digging. So you had one level that was already extremely high, but then you guys would have made it higher by digging in. Is that correct?
Yes, they're soil samples, and that's very well documented. It was surface soil. What they were afraid of is what would blow up in the first few inches during our frequent windstorms that we had there. We always had a wind there because of the ocean and the desert, the diurnal wind. As the desert heated up, it blew inland. As the desert cooled down, it blew to the ocean. We joked that Iraq not only sucked, but it blew. And you can edit that out. It was why they were so concerned. We were all very concerned about that upper crust, that sand and dirt, blowing around with all the contaminants. And digging deeper only made it worse.
You guys had no knowledge of this when you dug, is that correct?
No, we did not. We had no idea that there was buried toxins.
Okay. I can't think of commanders that I've worked for who would want this kind of thing to happen to their people. So does it sounds to me like you guys just had this awful place and they're trying to make it a little bit more livable and a little more bearable. Does that sound accurate to you?
It's because of the air quality. They were trying to make this as homey, if you will, as possible. Our food was good. They tried to do the best with the hours. I think they had our best interest at heart, at least at a local level. And it just got out of hand. And it never would have been good. If you look at the recommendations by the Army, every one of their first recommendations, it says, don't live there, find a better spot. But there was no seaport that could support the war. And that's how it was explained to us. We knew from the first month, you couldn't breathe, you couldn't run, you were bleeding from the nose, you were coughing up phlegm that would fill an average-sized water bottle daily. There was blood in your phlegm. We knew this was bad, and it was explained to us it was bad. But we had no other choice, and all of us wanted to do our part. Now we're just asking that the government step up and do theirs.
One of the things I find, having worked in intelligence, is that people hear something like intel and they often conjure this image of, Agent Mulder running over and saying something like this, hey, look, the truth is here. I'm going to just speculate a little bit here, but I think that it sounds like this is a case where people didn't want to see any of us get hurt, but they didn't recognize that they were making some pretty big mistakes here. And maybe now the problem isn't that they want to deny it so much as they don't want to admit that they made such a blistering error. And it's just easier to try and say that didn't happen. Does that sound accurate from your experience?
I would say 90% you're accurate. The one thing was they defied all the recommendations of the study by placing us there, but that was necessity. So yes, I will agree with your statement.
Well, and like Captain Bruni said in his interview, we recognize that when there's a war, there's a war. We go where the mission dictates, but now the war is over and it's time to take care of our people.
Yes, exactly.
You mentioned the blowing of the winds and that they would blow off these chemicals. Under what circumstances would they blow off these chemicals, and did these chemicals blow off towards you guys, or did the system always work the way that it was meant to?
No, when they would off-gas, depending on your location and the weather condition, they tried to balance it or coordinate it, I should say, with the weather. If there was an inversion layer, they wouldn't try to let loose with a large sulfur dioxide plume. They would wait until there was an offshore wind, and that would blow it over the ocean. But just as weather predictions go here in the States, they're just as bad there. The wind would blow the other way, or worse, there would be a minor inversion layer, and inversion layers plague Kuwait. Basically, that's a temperature change above that holds everything, and their inversion layers run between 800 and 3,000 feet. So basically, when it was a low inversion layer, the gas never was able to rise above that 800 feet.
So Chief Petty Officer Barth on his video has a picture showing water bottles, and it's really interesting because you look at this fence that it's sitting inside, and this fence has a nice little picture of a sign saying warning hazardous area. Would you please explain that?
Well, I discovered that when I was out investigating the dump site, which was right next to it. There was an open dump site, and then there was a huge number of 55-gallon drums, partially full to full, some empty, and some leaking materials from these drums. These drums were rusting. And I noticed all of these pallets of drinking water. Well, I immediately went to our base supply officer and said, why are we storing our drinking water in a hazardous waste dump? And he told me, and forgive me, devil dogs, if you're listening, that those damn jarheads keep stealing our water when they're heading out. And I found when I put them in the hazardous waste dump, they quit stealing them. And I said, yeah, that's because they're smarter than we are. We don't drink contaminated water. And what would happen in this, and especially with the ground-borne VOCs and the radioactive materials, the dust gets on the case. You open up the case, and as you know, in Iraq and Kuwait, the dust is so fine, it seeps in. When you open one of these boxes, cardboard boxes, and pull out a bottle of water, it's covered in dust. That dust is contaminated. So when you take the cap off, you drink, you touch, and the paths for all of these materials are inhalation, ingestion, and skin contact. So we're literally poisoning ourselves by storing our water so the Marines wouldn't steal it on their way out. And we tried to get that changed, but in the long run, it took almost until we were gone before we quit storing it there.
You know, we have these debates about which service is smarter, and I feel like, no disrespect to, again, the devil dogs, but I don't think it's very often they come out on top, but I think they're going to win this one.
Oh, the jarheads were a whole lot smarter than we were.
Let's talk about this slide that you had showing these officers talking to each other about how safe it was to be out there. One of the comments was that there was, that we could fairly accurately anticipate that there is going to be a Gulf War Syndrome 2 coming out of all of us being here. First and foremost, as someone who's held a security clearance, I just want to make sure, and I'm not questioning you or your character, but I have to ask this for everyone else to see. You did not procure, copy, print when no one else was looking. This didn't come from anything classified. Is that correct?
That's correct. By the way, the report that I often refer to was posted at a town hall meeting. There was literally a panic when a yellow cloud formed over the LSA. And what had happened was, by the way, that's the life support area. That's where we live, the LSA. And they posted this to show what was there. They were very, very honest at our local command, i.e., the 900 sailors and Coast Guardsmen. That was our force security officer, and the Captain 06 for non-sailor types went ahead and said, we'll post this. And we had 2 town hall meetings explaining what possible problems we could have from breathing in that much sulfur dioxide. So that was given to me. The reference you made to the second Gulf War syndrome, I was in my office when an Army captain came up, and this is after the big spill or the big release. There were no accidental releases. They were all deliberate and planned releases by the factory of these hazardous materials. And he said, I thought you might want to read these. And he gave me a number of emails that were going back and forth and supplied, and they were between medical doctors in the United States Army and also between their a lieutenant colonel who was a chemical biological expert, and they had these conversations back and forth. And one of the doctors was saying, we can't keep anybody here longer than 90 days or we'll be hurting them. In the same conversations between these three, it came up that, well, we can all be sure that this will be the second Gulf War syndrome here in Ashweba. And I can test from myself and my shipmates, and we all still keep in touch, we seem to be abnormally high number of problems relating to these target organs and types of cancer.
Which is interesting from my aspect, because as I work in critical care, I'm used to doing searches through various databases. For instance, if you would look into the World Trade Center on PubMed, which is a government health database for scholarly articles about new research being done, you'll find somewhere in the area of 2,300 articles talking about various cancers, synergistic effects, etc., etc. When you look for things like chronic multi-symptom illness, or even, I'm not sure what that number is right now, so we'll just say burn pits, you've got less than 50 articles. So for this topic in which you would expect to see, or the doctors out there would feel like we can prognosticate that there's going to be a lot of illnesses, it's been a long time, yet we don't really seem to be in any real hurry to learn more about this. I know that medicine isn't so much your specialty, but as you work with chemicals and biological agents and have some, some work through that area, have you seen anything to contradict that statement?
That would contradict it? No. And just for the record, and it's not much of a background, but I was an EMT in California for 32 years. So I have a basic understanding of what they say, signs and symptoms, treatments, but it's very elementary. But yes, it's shocking to me, and I've done a lot of research, and you mentioned the effects, the synergistic effect of chemicals. A number of the chemicals listed there all have synergistic effects, and they all attack the same organs, and many of these synergistic effects occur with these 36 different chemicals that they identified. What was interesting to me is they would do each chemical alone, even if it was a benzene. If it was benzene versus ethylene benzene, they would say, well, you can be exposed to this for 1 day up to 14 days with no problem, but we got the same dosage of another chemical that attacks the same organs as, all of them do. So is there a compounding of this effect? Where they said our VOCs are bad, but they don't violate it, and we think you'll be fine in 60 days. It would be the same as saying, well, I drank vodka, I drank whiskey, I drank tequila, and I drank rum, but I never exceeded any one of those limits. But they all attack the central nervous system, making you drunk. These all attack the same organs, making you sick. And so it's that compounding effect. I doubt any police officer, if you told them, no, I'm fine, I've only had vodka 1 shot, tequila 1 shot, whiskey, it wouldn't work. And that was our problem. It was the synergistic effect.
Well, strictly speaking, I feel like I get a little sicker sometimes when I mix my alcohols.
You know, there's got to be a little chemical difference between potato and rye whiskey. Maybe we should research that some other time.
Well, I think that we'll have no problem finding any candidates for that kind of study. You made reference earlier to requesting FOX vehicles. First and foremost, can you explain for anyone listening who's not familiar with a FOX vehicle what it is?
Well, at the time, it was a state-of-the-art chemical, biological, radiological monitoring vehicle that the military had. It could test air, it could test soil, liquid, and basically for such a mobile unit, if we were attacked by anything, it would show up. And that's in the biological chemical realm. We didn't specifically ask for that, but they said this is the best we can do for your chemical exposures. So the Fox vehicle came out. They could test for ammonia and for chlorine and other VOCs, especially like chlorine, which was a chemical weapon of mass destruction, if you will. So they came out and set up their vehicles. We had 2 of them there for a while, and they had an additional, on a flatbed, they had some monitoring equipment. And before the war started, we literally had some pretty major sandstorms. And it immediately came across as a biological attack. And we gave a warning, and we suited up, we did everything as to protocol. Then they came back and they did some air sampling of this sandstorm. Because what they initially measure it is by the micron size. Ideally, you want a biological weapon to be 2 to 3 microns. If it's 1 micron, you inhale it and you exhale it. If it's 4 micron, it gets stopped in the sinuses or in the mouth. So ideally, you want the 2 to 3. Very rarely will you find anything in nature that comes across as a huge mass in the sky of 2 to 3 microns, and that's what we had in this sandstorm. Well, they went out, they did all the vapor air testing, and they could find no biological. They did ground testing afterwards, and this took a little bit of time, but all they could find in theirs was sulfur, which was probably from the sulfur dioxide, but it was fine particulate, and their comment was, only in the Middle East can you find this fine of sand. And we have a large number of people who got asthma and bronchitis while they were there. And at 2 and 3 microns, they're going to go into the smallest parts of your respiratory system, to the alveoli, the bronchi, all the different parts of your lungs. And they can cause so many problems, especially when you add in the industrial waste that was going on in Iraq and Kuwait. Because now you're getting nitrous dioxide, you're getting sulfur dioxide, carbon monoxide. It's just this synergistic soup that is going to cause very odd diseases or ailments.
So to recap that a little bit, what I'm hearing you say is that you've got this little bit of sand that's essentially the perfect size for entrance into the worst part of the lungs, so much so that that's how we model our biological agents. That's part of what I was hearing from that. But the other part that is important that was attached to that is that attached to these little pieces of sand are all that toxic soup that you were living in. So essentially, it was taking the worst part of nature that you were stuck in and delivering it with the lethality that you would expect from a biological weapon to the point that the Fox vehicle alarm went off. Is that all accurate?
That is correct. We got the worst of Mother Nature. These soldiers didn't believe that there could be anything that fine of sand, any type of sand like that would go in and lodge in the lungs. And coupled with all the pollutants that we were there living with, it just made for the worst case scenario.
Okay, so the biological alarms on a Fox vehicle were going off. You weren't truly under a chemical attack, so technically it was a false positive. However, it still posed a significant health risk that the alarm was accurate in alerting you to. Is that correct?
That is. And we had multiple. The second one where it was these sandstorms could encompass all of Kuwait. And where they were picking up their sand, we knew we were getting it from here because there was sulfur content in the sand that they were testing in the air. Whether that was just the ambient pollutant or whether it was attaching to the sand, we may never know, but it was all being ingested or inhaled. And believe me, we ingested sand. You might start choking and cough up sand. For people who haven't lived through a good sandstorm in Iraq or Afghanistan, you have no idea where that sand can end up. I'll just put it at that. And your stomach, your lungs, your throat, your sinus passages. It was all bad. But the second attack, and what we thought was an attack, the alarm started and then was canceled because we realized it was just a remake of what we had last time. And we continued to get those until the Fox vehicles left. Readings for chlorine was fairly regular. Again, this vehicle wasn't designed for chemical pollution. It was designed for chemical warfare. And it gave us a lot of baseline information that we needed.
How many people lived at Camp Spearhead with you while you were there?
At one time, we were very concerned. We had a permanent cadre of close to 900 sailors and Coast Guardsmen. We had a company-size maintenance group of Marines, and that varied with leave and platoons leaving to go out in the field. And we had an Army maintenance crew, we had an Army Fire Department crew, we had Army Transcom unit, we had just a wide variety. But at our peak, we became concerned because it looked like we might be at 4,600 people. A lot of these were also transient people. If your equipment arrived, say you were at Camp Coyote in northern Kuwait, and all of a sudden a ship came in and offloaded your deuce and a halfs and Humvees, a platoon of drivers and aid drivers would come in and some mechanics, check out the vehicles. They'd probably spend a night or two there, get everything ready, and then they'd drive off. But those transient people were not allowed to stay more than 3 weeks. But the permanent cadre was probably 1,500 people or more. No more than 2,000 though.
In your experience, did a lot of, you said that people could stay up there for up to 3 weeks. In your experience, did many people stay past 15 days?
I would imagine, well, all of the permanent cadre, but I would imagine there were a few. I know we had a medical unit there that stayed for quite a while. Their vehicles, we were expecting massive casualties, and thanks be to God, we only had a minor in that first offensive, and they weren't used, so they stayed with their equipment maybe a month or two, and then they came home and left their equipment there. And then I guess later returned to pick it up.
We spent a lot of time obviously talking about just what happened there and what the technical ramifications are. You've been in contact with a lot of the people you served with, is that correct?
That's correct.
Would you be willing to just summarize some of the human suffering that has come from this as much as you feel comfortable with, just so that people can understand what this has done to us? Or I wasn't in Spearhead, but what this has done to the people who has been there.
Well, to give you an example, we had a small reunion with 7 or 8 of us because one of our shipmates who was there was dying of kidney cancer. He was diagnosed with stage 4 kidney cancer, and he's actually living on borrowed time at this time. Anyway, the 7 of us that came to visit him, we all got talking as we were getting ready to have breakfast. And 5 of the 7 had had skin cancer. The other 2 had actin and keratosis, which, though it can be done from sun exposure and other problems. 4, I believe, had asthma, and they never had it before. Or, well, one of them had brief childhood asthma, never used an inhaler. Now he uses an inhaler. All of them suffer from, you know, a lot of times they try to put it off as old age, but from the time they came home, they couldn't run as fast. They felt as if they were having some respiratory issues. All of them had respiratory issues at the time. I have other friends who have brain cancer who were there. Just anecdotally, when you talk to somebody, they will say, hey, have you heard about so-and-so? He's got kidney disease. Another friend who was forming masses on his kidneys. Luckily, he was just tested. They PET scanned him and did ultrasound. And they don't believe they're cancerous, but we're still in a holding pattern. Other people, and we notice this a lot, we hear comorbidities a lot in the age of COVID. If you were a smoker and you were at Assueva, we know for sure 5 individuals told me they were leaving, they were shipped out because they were forming cysts on the lungs. And they were sent, and then they said, I know those 5 for sure were, and they said another gentleman was sent home for the same thing. People who had asthma, that was basically nil. They didn't need inhalers. They just at one time in their life been diagnosed with asthma. They got horribly ill there. For myself, I had sinus infections to the point where they gave me a disability from Spearhead, the non-allergenic rhinitis due to environmental circumstances. Also, while I was there, and this was very common, we got cysts on our body, usually under the clothing. And what we had a doctor there at the base, he told us that that's from this finite sand rubbing and clogging your pores. That's what he thought. Well, I actually had, because if you don't have a picture, it never happened, was always my motto. I had them photograph the surgery as they removed cysts from my back. At the PSU, they sent a junior officer off to Germany because they couldn't figure out these rashes on his body. The individual, Mike Barth, who's given me permission to use his name, he had a number of rashes. They kept telling him it was ringworm. Well, I grew up in an era when ringworm was fairly common, and this was not ringworm. I looked at it and I knew it wasn't. He came home and it still followed him around, and it may still. There was an awful lot of what they called moccasin foot, and then there was also a fungus, what we thought was a fungus, and toenails would fall off. They said, oh, that's because it's the heat and you're wearing your boots. And it could well have been. But we just, I was in the infantry for 2 years. I served in 3 branches. And, trench foot is trench foot. This was not trench foot. But all of these different effects, and I literally would fill up a 16-ounce water bottle with phlegm that included blood, and it's documented in my medical records. I returned home and was diagnosed with voice box paresis. Literally, my voice box was burned. I didn't always sound this raspy, though I never had a sweet voice. It's almost too vast an area. I don't know of anyone who didn't get a rash while they were there at one time in their stay. And every one of these chemicals irritates the skin and causes skin rashes. So it's the VOCs. It's such a broad spectrum, and what we really need to do is get somehow, especially for the first 2 Harbor Defense Commands that deployed there, because we stayed there the longest. They literally, the officers in charge, after we were supposed to stay 10 months. We stayed 8 and then we left. The next unit, I was told, only stayed 6 months, and following that, they all slept off base and followed the rules. But we're still looking at maybe 10,000 to 20,000 people. And each one of these chemicals it's all got to do with exposure, dosage, and time. So if you were one of those guys playing volleyball, you got heavy exposure and a heavy dose. If you were just sleeping near them, you got dosed but not quite as heavy. So it's hard to say, should we all be at the same level? If you worked at the C2 building, sometimes we had to leave and go outside, which sometimes was even worse because of the accumulation of sulfur dioxide. The smell was just too much. And again, kidney, liver, lung cancer, and leukemia would all be on that list of things to look for. So far, what I'm seeing a lot of is kidney problems, skin problems, and respiratory.
Did the VEA grant you any compensation for your voice box paresis?
I never filed because they kept telling me it was caused by all the drainage from my non-allergenic rhinitis. And then they finally sent me to an ENT, and I just haven't filed yet, but I'm sure it'll be granted. There was a particular exposure on the 10th of May that literally sent the entire camp into a near panic. You couldn't breathe, you couldn't go anywhere. It was pretty bad. And it's documented. They vented a large amount of sulfur dioxide while there was a severe inversion layer at about 800 to 1,000 feet. It trapped these metric tons of gas, and it all settled on the LSA. You would literally step out of the tent, and you would see this yellowish color everywhere. If you inhaled, for me, when I stepped outside and took a breath, my throat just burned, my nose burns, my eyes burned, your skin tingled. And that's why we had the town hall meeting, the two of them, so that each watch could get. People had just came to the belief that they could die from these exposures. You know, if you can't breathe, the panic mode sets in pretty quick.
And they never coordinate, or did they ever coordinate with you when they would do these dumps, or give you any heads up that it was coming? They
promised they would, and even in the testing that they did in '99, there are certain days when the SO2 level skyrockets. Though there was never a day that we didn't exceed the 1-day limit or the 14-day limit for SO2. It was always off the charts. And so they claimed they were going to. We knew they were doing it. It's just that we didn't have that bad of an inversion layer when they let a major release. And what the supervisors told us, the plant managers, we at least once a week will release. And this time they had an awful lot. But we were constantly exposed. In a letter from our command that I have, they tell us that they will now coordinate, but they never did. At least we never heard it. And I worked at the BCOC, the Base Cluster Operations Center. I was a supervisor there. We were never informed of any release. We would call them on a hotline that we had. They said, "Oh, we're sorry. We meant to let you know."
That's reassuring.
Yeah.
And okay, is there anything else that you feel like we need to add to any of what we've talked about?
Well, I believe we've covered it all. It's, like I say, everything that I've got in writing was all posted during these town hall meetings. I was given them ahead of the meetings. Something anecdotal. I recall when the commanding officer asked me to read this, I read it. And then he said, "What do you think? I want to give this to the troops so they know what they're facing." And I turned to him and said, "Are we going home?" And he said, "No, why do you ask?" And I said, "You give them this, and it's going to dissolve the good order and discipline of the unit." You know, I didn't want to take a harsh stance, but to the commander's credit, he said, "No, I think everyone needs to know this." And I said, and to my praise of the units there, they all said, "Yeah, well, we'll suck it up. That's what you do in the service. This base needs to be open." And eventually they corrected the problem, but it took them over a year and a half to finally get the troops living off base, though they never hit that 60-day limit that was strongly recommended. Because after that 60 days, you're supposed to go to an annual exposure, and they knew that everything we were exposed to would exceed that and would be life-threatening. Even at a 60-day, they put the risk to soldiers at severe and high. So risk of injury and ailment due to the chemicals.
Can you just give me a brief rundown real quick of some of your highlights of your certifications?
Well, I attended a number of, my very first course was Monitor Survey and Identification course through the Marine Corps. I did combat casualties with the Marine Corps. I did a variety of those type. I went to USAMRIID. I've been to Tooele, Dugway. I've even been to Johnston's Island. These were through government agency courses on chemical and biological intelligence. I've been to Plum Island or Anthrax Island if you're a Silence of the Lamb fan. This was more on an intelligence gathering basis, but it helped to round me out. Civilian-wise, I've been to a vast number of hazardous materials technician course, which is a month long, hazardous materials specialist course, which is another 2 weeks, and countless recertifications and ICU classes. I went through nearly a month-long class to become a radiation protection safety officer at Fort McClellan, Alabama. I've been to the chemical agent where we actually work with live mustard, what was the other one? Sarin, Tobin, and Simone, all of the neurological and the nerve agents. And it's a pretty wide variety. If you put it all down, it's years of school. And that's why I was given the job of monitoring the chemical exposure there.
Mr. Brennan, I just want to thank you both for your service, but also for taking the time to talk with me about this and spread information. But also, I'd like to thank you for keeping all of this information, because it seems like there's a lot of places like this where this kind of information is pertinent to people who stayed there, yet people are having a lot of problems finding this information. Even for people who went to Spearhead at different times, they've described looking for information like this that they've heard is out there, but they can't find anyone who has it. So my hope is that your diligence in taking these notes and keeping these reports and taking these pictures will hopefully help people to get through some of the VA red tape and start getting both better treatment and screening before anything bad happens to them or anything worse happens to them.
Well, I think we might even be a little bit late from the number of the people that I've seen who are being diagnosed 16, 17 years later with stage 4 terminal cancers. But hopefully we can help some of the younger folks. I've noticed that if you're in your late 30s, early 40s, you seem to be sicker today than the young people. And I'm not sure why that is. Maybe it's my social network. And I'm not talking to some of the younger sailors, coasties, and soldiers.
As you and I have talked about, some of these topics get a little bit more complex, and we didn't really want to put into a single interview or a single documentary. So it's my hope that we can film some more things later on where we just get maybe one by one into the nitty-gritties of VOCs or various topics, so that we can just get those things ironed out for the people who they apply to, but then not lose everyone else who doesn't have as much to do with them. And I hope that you'll share some interest in that as well.
I'm with you all the way. Glad to help.
Thank you for your time. It's been great talking to you, and I look forward to doing it again.
You're welcome, and thank you.